The next hearing in Donald Trump's hush money criminal case is not until December 4th. That's 8 months away. But there is a trial involving Donald Trump coming up much sooner. This month, in fact. On April 25th, Donald Trump goes on trial here in New York for the battery and defamation of E. Jean Carroll. She's a former columnist and magazine writer. She alleges that Donald Trump raped her in a New York department store dressing room in the mid-1990s. Here's what she told me about that incident just a few years ago.
The minute he closed that door, I was banged up against the wall.
He slammed you against the wall.
Yeah, I hit my head really hard. Boom. I was stunned, right? And then he tried to kiss me, which was, it was so hard. But so my reaction was to laugh, to knock off the erotic whatever he had going on. Because the man, when you laugh at him, he's like, ugh. No, you know, he just went at it.
And when you say went at it, you know, I mean,
he pulled down my tights. And it was a fight. It was I want women to know that I did not stand there. I did not freeze. I was not paralyzed, which is a reaction that I could have had because it's so shocking. No, I fought.
Carroll sued Trump after he posted on social media last year that her accusation is a hoax and a lie, and writing, quote, "This woman is not my type." We have a lot to discuss with my new panel here. We have Misty Maris. She's a defense and trial attorney. We also have John Hart, former communications director for Senator Tom Coburn. Lauren Leader is a political analyst, and Jessica Washington is senior reporter for The Root. Great to have all of you here. Misty, as our attorney, what do you think of this case? I mean, let me just start by saying that because I think we've all been consumed with what the Manhattan DA is doing and with the Stormy Daniels thing, I think that we've given short shrift to this E. Jean Carroll case, which she's been talking about for years, and now, and we will talk about that, and that'll be next. But in terms of the case, tell us what we need to know.
Yeah, this case has really been overlooked in light of everything else that's going on, but I've been following this case very closely. So here's what we have. We have a defamation case, and the defamation case is that Donald Trump went and said, she's a liar, she's mentally ill, this is a hoax, all of these defamatory statements. Well, now there's also another claim. It is an Adult Survivors Act claim. That is for the underlying battery, which is the alleged rape. So in general, look, this case goes back to the 90s. She's the plaintiff. This is a civil case, so she has to prove this case by a preponderance of the evidence. That's very, very difficult when you go back so far in time. And this is a new statute in New York, so we're looking back to these older cases.
So let me ask you this, why is it battery, not rape?
So that's in a civil charge. In a civil case, it's going to be battery. In a criminal case, it would be rape. But look, there's some evidence that's going to come into the courtroom in an evidentiary decision that just came down. There's going to be 2 other women who claim to be survivors in similar circumstances with Donald Trump. The judge says that's going to come in. Both of those instances where he isolated them and did the exact same thing, same type of thing. This is coming in as what's called propensity evidence. And another one, the old Access Hollywood tape, that's coming in to show that he, in his own words, has touched women without their consent in the past. So the scales have really changed from what is usually a big haul for the plaintiff to having some corroborating evidence on their behalf. So I'm really interested to see how this plays out.
Yeah, I mean, Allison, you're right to point out that we should be paying more attention to this case. And I've been saying this for weeks, actually, and we talked about it a little bit when I was here last time. I mean, it is profoundly important when you look at sort of what is happening in Donald Trump's world this week and the number of cases that involve abuse of women, fundamentally, that are closing in around him, right? The Stormy Daniels case ultimately was about him trying to silence women and going to extraordinary lengths to cover up to the public his abominable behavior and treatment of women, especially right after the Access Hollywood case. And then in the same month, you've got Jean Carroll's incredibly important case. And, you know, you really have to feel for Jean Carroll because she has had everything working against her in trying to bring this case. She's been at this for decades. And it is thanks to this Survivors Act in New York that there isn't even an opening for her. And that also speaks to the number of people, women, children, et cetera, who've had sexual assault cases, experiences in their lives, and it has taken them years to be able to talk about it. And it was an incredibly important legal precedent in New York that allows these cases to go forward. So we should not be overlooking this. It's important.
And one of the women that Misty was just talking about that's going to be allowed to be part of this trial is a woman named Jessica Leeds. She's not accusing Donald Trump of rape, but she does say that he groped her on a plane. So here's what she told Anderson in 2016.
He was grabbing my breasts and trying to turn me towards him and kissing me. Then after a bit, that's when his hands started going. I was wearing a skirt, and his hands started going towards my knee and up my skirt. His hands were everywhere.
Did he actually kiss you?
Yeah, yeah.
On the face or on the lips?
Wherever he could find a landing spot.
Jessica, more than a dozen women over the years have accused Donald Trump of some kind of sexual misconduct.
Yeah, it is truly horrifying. And I think what Eugene Carroll said is not outside of the pale of what we've heard from these other accusations. In a previous job that I had, part of what I was doing was keeping track of Trump's, of the allegations against Trump, all the credible ones. And you just kept hearing patterns that were so similar. So we can talk about the politics of this at a certain point, but we also just have to say, this is someone who was a former US president who is now a presidential candidate and has this many accusations. And the fact that it hasn't moved the needle in some ways is also really concerning.
John, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think it's perilous for Republicans to reflexively support Donald Trump and defend him. You know, members of Congress were elected to the House of Representatives, not the House of Defense Attorneys. And the response they should give to these allegations is to say, that's for Trump's defense attorneys to handle. He deserves due process. But Republicans should focus on their agenda. The same day he was indicted, the House passed H.R. 1, the Lower Energy Cost Act, which is the Republican vision for how to do energy innovation, how to help the climate, how to help the economy grow. And that's what Republicans ought to be focused on.
They're not. I mean,
Well,
you hear them. Well, I mean, they are circling the wagons around.
They want to be.
No, they don't. I suppose, but I mean, it's hard to see that when they, as you point out, yes, of course, reporters ask them questions about this. So I understand that they wouldn't want necessarily that to be their first order of business. However, they're not distancing themselves from Donald Trump.
Well, not enough are. But you know, look, the House, if you took a private poll of Republicans, a vast supermajority would rather be talking about H.R. 1. They don't want to be talking about Donald Trump. And the more members make courageous decisions to not defend him, the easier it's going to be, and the more they're going to be rewarded politically for doing that.
Republicans have a very serious women problem, and they've had a serious women problem for the last 3 election cycles, and that is by aligning themselves with Donald Trump. They've alienated suburban women voters who have voted aggressively against them for now 3 cycles and have handed a huge number of elections to Democrats. And the problem with, you know, this sort of unwillingness to ever come out in public and condemn behavior that they know is repellent to women voters is that they continue to repel women voters. And I think this is another one of those cases. If they want to be talking about H.R. 1, they should really be talking about H.R. 1 and not be talking about, you know, not be trashing every prosecutor and every witness and every person involved in these cases.
Do you
Let
agree?
the
Hold on,
justice
let me have him
play
respond.
out.
Do you agree?
Well, no, it's not a totally partisan issue. Look, there are plenty of Democrats like Bill Clinton who have a very troubled history with women.
But
And-
right now, do you agree that Republicans still have a women problem?
Absolutely, yeah. Republicans have a very serious challenge winning not just women voters, but suburban voters, because they have pandered to Trump's vision of populism. And that is not conservative. It's not constitutional. So Republicans have a path forward if they go back to Reagan conservatism. Trump was successful when he deferred to the Reagan coalition. And that coalition is still a lot more powerful than people give it credit for.
Missy, I want to go back to the Eugene Carroll case. So is Donald Trump going to have to testify?
He really is, because keep in mind, this is a civil case. That's a really important distinction. In a criminal case, a defendant can sit at the table and choose not to testify, and you cannot hold it against that individual. In a civil case, they are compelled to testify. If he were to not testify, an adverse inference, which is a negative inference, can be taken by the jury, and they can assume whatever he would have said would have been to his detriment. So he's already testified under oath, though. There is a deposition out there. So I would expect his lawyers to be prepping him within the confines of whatever came out in the 4 corners of that deposition. But keep in mind, when you get on the stand, credibility is king. So now we're going to be talking about challenging his credibility, and it might go outside the scope of this case. I would expect the plaintiff's attorneys to push for catching him in all sorts of untruths, the veracity of anything he said, even outside of this case. and the defense to try and narrow it. And that's the fight we're going to see go on in the courtroom. I know this judge, he's very fair, but he will take that step if it is within the confines of the law. And again, credibility is a central issue in a case, especially one where it really is both sides of the story without a lot of corroborating evidence since it happened back in the 90s.
Yeah. And politically, one thing I am interested in seeing from this case is what happens when Republicans have a choice, because a lot of these things came out after the primaries. So we're actually seeing these allegations are going to be talked about in court. Trump is, like you said, going to have to testify and discuss these things ahead of a primary, when Republicans will actually have a choice between candidates and not necessarily when they'll feel like it's either a Democrat or a Republican. And so I think this is a test. This is a true test of where the party is at if Trump were to win the nomination after having this trial.
It's so interesting, as we were talking about, Lauren, because we also talk so much about what's going on in Georgia, and that's seen as very high stakes, high legal jeopardy for Donald Trump. Of course, January 6th and what's happening with the special prosecutor. This case that has consumed so much energy this week in Manhattan. But this one is where he will have to, theoretically, be on the stand. I mean, this is also a very vulnerable moment.
I think we've really underestimated actually how powerful and important this case may be. I mean, we as media and those covering it, I've been saying this for a long time. I mean, especially in this sort of like post-Weinstein world, right? There is a new level of accountability in the public, I think, for, attacks on women. We're going to see how far that accountability goes. Clearly Trump has never been held accountable for his misogyny. We knew about the Access Hollywood tapes, but of course now it does all sort of fit together. And to your point about the fact pattern, right? You look at the dynamics of the Stormy Daniels case, that he was in fact trying to cover up, the allegations are that he was hiding this information for the public specifically so they wouldn't know who he was and what he had done in order to win the election, right? And it's not that dissimilar in the Jean Carroll case, right? Just deny, deflect, attack. It's all the same pattern. So I think it's an incredibly important case. She deserves a ton of credit for her courage in persisting, which is not easy. I said the same thing about Stormy Daniels and about Karen McDougal. The women who are involved in these cases, it is hell for them. And it should be played out in a court, but, we need to take it seriously.
So if E. Jean wins, what happens to Donald Trump?
It's monetary damages. It's a civil case. I do think one interesting point quickly before we end, all of these cases do have impacts on each other.
Yeah.
In this particular case, the judge has already said the jury is going to be anonymous. Why? Because of the statements that Donald Trump has made against the judiciary, against other jurors relating to other cases. By the way, that's unheard of in a civil case. That's usually held for terrorism cases and cases involving organized crime. So that's the bucket that this case is in. That's incredibly remarkable, given that we have a civil case in a federal court and it's being treated with that type of care to ensure that the jury is protected.
Really interesting. Thank you all for the perspectives and all that information. All right, next.